Welcome back to another one of your Flip Lectures. Today we're going to talk about the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, and the changing role of the American government. By the year 1932, the Great Depression was well underway, and unemployment is going to reach 25%. And so it's against this backdrop where the election of 1932 is going to take place, pitting the incumbent, President Herbert Hoover, against the challenger, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York. A lot of people blamed Herbert Hoover for not doing enough to alleviate the suffering of the Great Depression, and so in a landslide victory, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to become president. And his campaign is going to promise a New Deal. Similar to Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, it promised an active government that would be involved in trying to solve the problems of the Great Depression. His campaign was also rooted in confidence and optimism. His campaign song was Happy Days Are Here Again, and he ended up being an extraordinarily popular president, being elected 4 times, the only president to be elected that many. And so Americans in large numbers responded to Roosevelt's optimistic, positive message about the future. As you can see from this election map, he won in 1932 in a landslide. And when he went to go be inaugurated as president in early 1933 and moved into the White House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the American people that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself, and that confidence and optimism, more than anything else, would help fix the Great Depression. And so his strategy in the election of 1932 is interesting. And the New Deal is really a try-anything approach, that the government should just be doing anything and everything to try to fix the problem. And interestingly enough, this New Deal platform is going to pull together a new coalition of voters that had never all voted Democrat before. The New Deal has a lot of benefits for minorities who had previously voted Republican, the party of Lincoln. They're going to shift over to the Democrats. The Democrats are also going to become the party of organized labor, as the New Deal is going to have a lot of reforms to the union movement and working conditions. And then finally, the liberal intellectuals, the old progressives, those who just simply believe the government needed to be involved, are all going to join together to win this 1932 election. So after Roosevelt took office, he set out to pass his New Deal through Congress. And the New Deal had 3 R's, similar to the Square Deal's 3 C's. And so the goals of it were relief, recovery, and reform. Relief meaning to relieve the suffering of the Great Depression, recovery to try to end the Great Depression, and reform to try to stop the Great Depression from ever happening again. So in Roosevelt's first 100 days of office, he called an emergency session of Congress to pass his New Deal legislation. And so this was a host of new laws and programs that were all meant to address the issues of the Great Depression. And one of the first of these was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which actually called a bank holiday, forcing all banks to close and requiring them to pass a certain number of government regulation before they could reopen. And so the goal of this was to restore people's confidence in the banks that had been shattered by all the bank runs of the early Great Depression. So President Roosevelt also had another tool to help him get his New Deal passed. He had what no president before him really used: the radio. The radio is a great tool for a president because they can go around Congress and elected officials and speak directly to the people. And so every week, President Franklin Roosevelt would go on the radio and deliver an address to the nation that he would call his fireside chats, in which he would try to give them optimism, let them know what the government was doing to try to solve the Great Depression, and ask for their support. Almost all presidents now utilize the television when they want to directly address the American people, a trend started by Franklin Roosevelt. And so the New Deal approach is not really going to be a consistent ideological belief. It is a host of diverse approaches and really a try-anything approach. And so Roosevelt's advisors all kind of disagreed. Some people thought the government and business should get together and cooperate, similar to the World War I war effort. Others thought the government should actually just take over the whole economy and centrally plan setting prices, setting wages, in order to try to end the Depression. Other people thought that the problem was actually too many monopolies, and that ultimately by trust busting and breaking up big companies and big banks, that would solve the crisis. And so the New Deal is going to be kind of a mishmash of all these different approaches. And so one of the big changes that the New Deal is going to bring about is the regulation of banks in the stock market. The Securities and Exchange Commission is created in order to basically police the stock market. And the Security Exchange Commission is in charge of enforcing laws dealing with the stock market. Companies are required to file financial documents, statements of profits and costs with the Security Exchange Commission, and they basically investigate all fraud, abuses, and risky behaviors within the stock market. They still do this today. In order to also solve the problem of banks losing a lot of depositors' money in the stock market, the Glass-Steagall Act was passed that separated investment banks from commercial banks. And so commercial banks, those that just take regular deposits from ordinary people, they weren't allowed after this to risk people's deposits in stock market speculation. Now, Glass-Steagall was removed in the 1980s, and a new-ish version of it was passed after the 2008 housing crisis, but the basic idea is to try to limit the exposure of the average American to things like speculation. Then the final piece of this puzzle is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation's job is to stop bank runs. And so what the federal government says is they will protect all your deposits up to $250,000. And they also supervise all banks that are members. So if your bank is an FDIC bank and it goes bankrupt, the government will actually pay you for your deposits up to $250,000. Another approach outside just regulating the financial sector was actually regulating industry and production. And so the New Deal had a number of programs all aimed at actually controlling both prices and wages. The first of these was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA. And it actually paid farmers not to grow crops in order to raise their prices. And so the idea of this is by limiting supply, you can actually control prices and perhaps raise them. Secondly, the National Industrial Recovery Act creates the National Recovery Administration. And this created what Roosevelt called codes of fair competition. This involved price fixing, setting new minimum wages, limiting working hours, as well as support for unions. Ultimately, the NIRA really fails to fix the Great Depression, but it does introduce kind of some new ideas. The idea of a minimum wage, and especially the idea of heavy government regulation of businesses. Eventually, though, this will be declared unconstitutional. It's beyond the power of the government to actually make these rules about businesses. So then another thing that the New Deal tried to do was actually just provide relief to people who were suffering during the Great Depression. One of these organizations that started under Hoover, was expanded under Roosevelt, was the HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And essentially what this would do is give you some debt relief, give you some money to pay your mortgage if you were having difficulty with that. And so that was one way that they were trying to alleviate some of the suffering. There's also the creation of Social Security, as well as a number of work programs, all designed to provide kind of a safety net and put money in the pocket of average Americans. And so these work programs are diverse, but some of the most popular ones include the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. Now, Civilian Conservation Corps actually created jobs for young men because a lot of young men were unemployed, traveling the country as hobos, and so this was seen as an opportunity to give them work experience. Mostly they worked in national parks, places like that, building things, and as well as kind of chopping down trees and all sorts of other stuff. What the Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men was room and board and a chance to work and send money home. And so the idea of this is to restore pride in people, give them the satisfaction of working and sending money home, and ultimately trying to restore people's confidence in the United States. So other work programs include the Tennessee Valley Authority, which actually the government paid for and provided utilities such as electricity as well as kind of running water to some areas in Appalachia that were hit hard by the Great Depression. But again, someone has to be paid to build all those electrical wires, and so this was a jobs creator. Similarly, the Works Progress Administration is the largest of all the work programs. And as the poster says, the point of the WPA was that work promotes confidence. And the more people were working, the more optimism there would be. And so the WPA involved the construction mostly of public works and public buildings, such as roads, dams, bridges, hospitals, schools, parks, and airports. But the WPA also put artists to work and musicians, and the government actually paid them to paint murals inside of government buildings, write plays, put on cheap shows, create art. And so the point of the WPA was to try to put as many Americans back to work as possible. The logic being, if people had money in their pockets, they'd be able to spend it, and that would hopefully both help their suffering as well as fix the Great Depression itself. So the New Deal is also going to involve the creation of the first social safety net, with the creation of Social Security. And Social Security is basically social insurance that you can collect money from the government if you are either somebody over a certain age, covers federal old age retirement. If you lose a job, or if you are a family with children, you can get Social Security assistance. So the idea of social insurance is that it's paid for by a payroll tax on current workers. So that every paycheck that you make, they take out money for Social Security. And then the idea is that you then collect that money when you reach a certain age. Now, the point of Social Security was to provide a safety net for those who were most vulnerable during the Great Depression. The elderly were very vulnerable, as well as families with children, as well as those who are going to lose work. And so Social Security today still provides the safety net for average Americans, and we've even expanded even further on that idea. So one of the things that the New Deal is going to do is it's going to put labor front and center in American politics. By passing the Fair Labor Standards Act and creating the National Labor Relations Board, the federal government gave unions the right to exist and the right to negotiate. And the Fair Labor Standards Act also abolished child labor, set a minimum wage, and set a 40-hour work week as the standard, requiring overtime pay for more than 40 hours. And so ultimately, for the first time under the New Deal, the government is going to actually take the side of some major American unions. However, the New Deal is not without controversy. Although it was popular, and FDR is going to be reelected on the platform 3 times, many critics of the New Deal are going to point out problems with this approach. The first major problem is that this involves deficit spending. These programs are very expensive, and the government had to borrow money to pay for them, resulting in the explosion of the national debt, which many said was irresponsible. There's also this idea of the expansion of government power, that all these New Deal programs that are basically costing a lot of money, that are regulating businesses very heavily, are actually taking freedom away from businesses. Especially things like price fixing and the setting of wages were very kind of controversial. But on the other side, some people thought that the New Deal actually did not go far enough, that the government actually needed to do more in taking over industry and providing relief. And so the New Deal was controversial both for doing too much as well as for not doing enough. And so Roosevelt's controversial New Deal actually went toe-to-toe with the Supreme Court a couple of times. And several New Deal programs, including the NIRA and the AAA, were actually declared unconstitutional. Because the question became, how much can the federal government intervene in the U.S. economy? And what the Supreme Court said was that basically Congress did not have the power to actually fix prices and enforce a code of conduct, as well as pay farmers not to grow crops. And so ultimately, the Supreme Court's approach, we kind of see here, is a tension between the limited government, laissez-faire attitude, and the new activist government that was promised with the New Deal. And so in response to the controversies over the New Deal's constitutionality, Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually did something very unpopular. He actually tried to get Congress to add more members to the Supreme Court so that he could appoint them and appoint loyal people who would say his New Deal was constitutional. The American public was outraged by this, and President Roosevelt was forced to back down from this court packing idea because, again, like this political cartoon, people were critical, thinking that he was basically acting beyond the Constitution, almost as the king of democracy. So other reasons people were critical of this was a question of socialism, that taking from one group of Americans to give to another kind of goes against the individualism that was a part of American culture. It also expands the size and power of the government, and of course, with a bigger government and doing more things, it's going to be more expensive, leading to debt. And so one other controversy surrounding the New Deal involved the 1937 Roosevelt recession, when the economy kind of crashed a second time. Now, the economy crashed a second time after the New Deal spending levels actually dropped a little bit. And so the people who would agree with kind of the Chicago School F.A. Hayek monetarist theory would just say that all that government spending was a second bubble, and it was inevitable that by 1937 it would burst. But other people said, on the Keynesian side, that actually the reason we went back into recession is that the government did not spend enough. And so again, even the idea of like what caused kind of the Great Depression to continue is a subject of debate between economists. So ultimately, the New Deal is not really going to fix the Great Depression, but it does change some really significant things. The first thing it changes is the government's role. that Americans begin to expect the government to take a very heavy hand in the economy, as well as providing a safety net for all Americans. Now, this is controversial because, again, the old attitude is that all are people responsible for themselves, or do we have a collective responsibility to each other? And then finally, the federal government is going to become much more large and much more powerful during Roosevelt's presidency. Some other things in society change. Social Darwinism as an attitude is going to kind of be hurt by the experience of the Great Depression. As more and more people see circumstances as determining outcomes, there is a move towards more social responsibility and more belief in an activist government. And so ultimately, we can judge if the New Deal is a success or a failure based on a couple of criteria. Did it provide relief? Did it provide recovery? And did it provide reform? Even though the New Deal does not end the Great Depression, we can say that it is successful in some ways. Provides some relief, gives some people a chance to work, but ultimately the Great Depression is not going to end until December 7th of 1941, the date which will live in infamy.